I'm Derek T. Dingle, Chief Content Officer at Black Enterprise. Welcome to this all-new edition of Boardroom Chats hosted by Nationwide. Today, I have the opportunity to discuss the career journey and boardroom impact of Kenneth Bacon, co-founder of Railfield Partners. Prior to forming Railfield, he spent 19 years at Fannie Mae, where he served as Executive Vice President and head of its multifamily business. During his tenure there, he oversaw a portfolio of $195 billion in assets that included multifamily mortgages, conventional equity, and mezzanine debt. Prior to running the division, he was responsible for the management of the American Communities Fund and its affordable lending and community development programs. He has also held leadership positions at Morgan Stanley and Kenneth Peabody. Throughout his career, he served on multiple corporate boards, including Comcast and Ally Financial. Currently, he serves as board chair of Welltower, a publicly traded real estate investment trust, or REIT. An alumnus and former trustee of Stanford University, he has also received his MBA from Harvard Business School and studied at the London School of Economics. He is here today to share his views on the importance of board service and how he found his voice as a corporate director. Ken, thank you for joining us for this episode of Boardroom Chats.
Okay.
I want to spend some time talking to you about your fascinating career journey and to share with our audience about multifamily real estate and real estate financing. And then so the core of the conversation, which is on your experiences in corporate governance and your view in terms of how to make it more inclusive as well as beneficial to the corporations in which you serve.
Okay.
Starting off, I found something very interesting as I was looking at your background. You were originally, when you started at Stanford, and correct me if I'm wrong, an anthropology major.
That's correct.
What led you going from anthropology to real estate financing?
Happenstance. I did anthropology because, that's the study of man. I was always interested in different cultures. Growing up, my father was a Baptist. His family was from Mississippi. My mother was Catholic. Her family was originally from Louisiana. So I grew up kind of seeing differences in religion, food, language. So I was always interested in that type of stuff. And while I was at Stanford, I had an opportunity to do some research in the West Indies, Trinidad and Guyana. When I got back, I told one of my professors, I said, boy, I wish I could, go overseas again. So they encouraged me to apply for a fellowship, a Marshall Fellowship in England. So I was in London. And I went over being kind of left wing, third world rights and everything. And the dorm I stayed in was people from all the British colonies. So I was around a lot of brothers from Nigeria and Ghana and the Bahamas and Jamaica. And most of them were either studying to be lawyers or accountants or something business-wise. And when I once confronted one of my Nigerian friends, I said, how can you work for the oil companies and exploiting your people and everything? He said, Ken, I just don't want to work for an oil company. I want to own an oil company. So that turned me on to business because I realized that business, growing up in segregated Texas, business always seemed something for not for us. And when I went overseas, I met people who look like me, who are all about business. So that changed my attitude. And when I came back to the States, I shaved my beard, cut my afro a little bit, and got a job at IBM. And I went to business school. And when I was getting out of business school, I ended up taking a job in public finance. And my area of expertise was housing. I did tax-exempt housing bonds. So it's a convoluted journey, but it just flowed like that.
It's a fascinating journey. Just want to take a little detour for a second because you have a commonality with three of the subjects that we've engaged in for the past few episodes of Boardroom Chats. All three subjects have, well, primarily in technology, but have been with IBM. What was about the IBM experience that positioned you to be masterful in not only in business, but in corporate governance?
So it was interesting. When I joined IBM, what happened? My father's minister, Reverend William Lawson, Bill Lawson, his wife said, "Here you're looking for a job," and there are several people at my dad's church who worked at IBM. And to give IBM credit, IBM was, before anybody was talking about diversity, IBM was ahead of its time, in that there were lots of Black professionals there. And while, again, I'm sure someone could say, oh, it wasn't perfect, could have been better, but compared with a lot of other institutions, particularly in my hometown of Houston, Texas, so it was a place, one, there was some diversity there. And secondly, IBM would take raw talent and train you, right? I didn't know a thing about computers, had never used a computer, hadn't touched a computer, but IBM said, we will teach you. So they, and you got training not only in the technology, but doing presentations, how to do a sales call. So it was very much practical business experience. And there were managers. Every course I took, there would usually be somebody who looked like me, either at my level in the classroom, but oftentimes managers. So it was supportive. There were role models. And it was, at that time, I'd say IBM and Xerox were in the forefront of if you were Black in business.
In looking at your career, you touch on some of the elements of the first wave of corporate managers and entrepreneurs that we've covered. In fact, IBM was one of our first advertisers, and
Wow.
they had pushed forward the whole focus on diversity and training and in business. I want to go back to your experiences in real estate financing, which has led to your ascension in to board positions as well as within that industry. What led you to take the path from IBM to multifamily housing as a career and to plant your flag in that sector?
Well, what happened when I took a job at IBM, I had plans to go to business school. In fact, my debate was whether I go to just an MBA or whether I do a JD MBA. So I decided I applied to business school. And not that I thought IBM was bad, but I wanted to broaden my horizons in business. And when I was in business school, my strengths were really strategy and finance. And so when I was interviewing for jobs, I interviewed with a lot of investment firms. But I told you when I went to England, I was kind of like left wing and all this stuff. I still had what I call the do-good gene in me. I still wanted to do things that I felt good about. And so corporate finance, while it was intellectually interesting, it didn't really line up with my values. I'm not saying it was bad, but it just wasn't me. And so I started in public finance and I was doing housing. It allowed me to go back to my home state of Texas because there was a lot of tax exempt, housing bonds and apartments getting built. And plus it was something tangible. I always like to tell people, again, I'm not knocking a Procter and Gamble, but I couldn't get excited. I couldn't identify with doing detergent or doing cosmetics. Beautiful thing that when you did anything real estate related, you could see what you financed. You could see it come out of the ground. You could see people living there. So when I was doing tax exempt housing bonds, I really liked it. And started in tax exempt, but what happened, the revolution in mortgage finance was happening. Securitization happened. So the firm I was at, Kidder Peabody, they needed a banker. They had some traders and they wanted to start doing the securitized things. That was hot at Solomon Brothers then. And so my boss said, look, the best banker we got who could do this is Ken Bacon. So, I would do the SEC filings and commitment memos for the firm's investment committee. So I started doing that. GE bought Kidder Peabody, so I left Kidder and went to Morgan Stanley. And when I was at Morgan Stanley, I worked with savings and loans. Uh, and again, who had loan portfolios they wanted to securitize. So that's how again, I got deeper into it. And it was also, that's where I met Dick Parsons. Because
Okay.
Dick Parsons was the head of the Dime Savings Bank, and he was one of the Morgan Stanley clients. So that was a big influence on me too. I got to meet Dick.
So that was also part of the whole S&L crisis of
Yeah.
the 80s and the
Yeah.
transformation of, S&Ls to savings banks. And then you
Yeah.
talk about dime savings. Share with us those times because those were heady times in terms of finance. That was the first wave of, African Americans in
Uh-huh.
investment banking. And then as you're talking, and especially with the passing of Dick Parsons, I'd like you to share a bit of your experience with Dick and how that helped shape you in business and in life.
That's a lot. But well,
I can
again, I
start
mean,
with SNL, the SNL crisis, and
yeah,
then we can talk about Dick
yeah.
Parsons. Your
So I'm at Morgan Stanley, and all of a sudden, a lot of my clients start getting taken over by the government. And so a lawyer I knew in Texas called me one day and said he was working for the board of the agency the government created to oversee the savings and loan resolution of savings and loan crisis, the RTC, Resolution Trust Corporation. And so he was always calling me asking for market conditions, advice. And so I decided to leave Morgan Stanley and go work in government. Everybody at Morgan Stanley thought I was crazy. My wife thought I was crazy. But my clients were going away. So I said, I'll either have to pick a different field. But I said, this is what I know. So I went and worked in government. My first job was as director of policy for the board that oversaw the savings and loan resolution. And that was probably the best job I've ever had in my life because the board of at that time was the Secretary of the Treasury, Nick Brady, Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Fed, Jack Kemp, the head of HUD, and two private sector people. One guy was in charge of Bob Larson, head of Taubman Real Estate, and a gentleman named Philip Jackson, who was a retired governor of the Federal Reserve. So, every month I would be in meetings with these people. Every week I would go to the Treasury to brief them, and I was developing strategies because the government had, several $100 billion worth of mortgages and real estate from the savings and loan. So I had to develop a strategy for that. And I ultimately ended up going to the RTC itself and helping to set up the asset sales program, the securitization program. And that I really learned a lot about real estate because the best way to learn about real estate is when you see bad deals. And I tell people I got a PhD in bad deals because I saw so many failed institutions, bad loans, poor underwriting. So I learned a lot. And I also was able to do a lot because at that time, the Black firms on Wall Street were primarily municipal finance firms. And one of the things I was able to do with the help of my boss and the encouragement of the board uh, was that I mandated that minority firms participate. So people like John Utendahl's firm, uh, Siebert's firm. So there were various small women-owned and Black-owned firms, some Latino firms, and I got them into the sales when we would sell bonds. Um, So that was just a great job, but I wasn't making any money. So after doing that for 3 years, my funds were getting low, and Dick was one of the people I called, and Fannie Mae. I had done business with Fannie Mae in government, and so Fannie Mae wanted to talk to me. Dick thought that would be a good move. Some other people I knew thought that would be a good move, so I went to Fannie Mae, and Dick ended up being on the board of Fannie Mae. So he was someone for several years I could turn to for advice. And Dick was I was very fortunate that, to know him. He was a great man.
Yeah. So you saw him as not only as a friend, I'm sure, but as one of your mentors in this
Mhm.
financial arena, especially as finance was and housing was going under this major reconstruction.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a time of securitization changed the markets. And so it was a time of like I call kind of a revolution of financial technology. And so I was able to kind of participate in that as one of the creators, and that was fun. And then at that time, Fannie Mae is now a ward of the government, but at that time, Fannie Mae was we were the guys in white hats, and we had a great chairman, Jim Johnson. Uh, uh, the number two guy at Fannie Mae at that time was Frank Raines, who became one of the first black CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. And there were other Black people there in executive roles. So again, I was very fortunate that just like at IBM, I was at an institution that, as Jim Johnson used to say, he felt that Fannie Mae should look like America. So I had Dick Parsons on the board. I had Jim Johnson, who even after I left Fannie Mae, after he retired, I still met with once or twice a year. Uh, Jim was the person who introduced me to Vernon Jordan. And so it was Frank Raines. So I just had tremendous mentors and role models while I was at Fannie Mae.
That's 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 amazing. This is I'm glad that we're having this conversation because this is a history lesson in terms of just the transformative nature of finance,
Mhm.
what happened
Mhm.
in the 80s and how it begot so much of that's a part of finance today. Uh, Share your role at Fannie Mae. When you went over to Fannie Mae, tell me that experience, what you learned. You've been there, you were there for I believe 19 years.
19
And
years, yes.
yeah, and tell me how that was, transformative, not only in your career, but in terms of housing in general and helping to provide community development and affordable housing to people throughout the nation, including African American.
Well, when I joined Fannie Mae, my first 6 years, I ran a region. Fannie Mae had a regional structure then. And so I was in Philadelphia, never had just ridden a train through Philadelphia, never really been there. City I learned to love, still do love. And my customers were the New York banks. I had Puerto Rico. So I got to deal with a lot of financial institutions in a general manager role. So I wasn't a specialist in multifamily. I dealt with single family. And Fannie Mae, under Jim Johnson's leadership, he was very concerned that the Black home ownership rate was very low. So Fannie Mae was doing lots of experiments with lending, counseling, working with states and cities to create programs to facilitate Black home ownership. We also started doing some community development things. So uh, when Frank Raines succeeded Jim Johnson as chairman, he brought me down to Washington, and we had a community development effort that was kind of struggling. So I spent about a year and a half turning that around. And then there was a brother who had been running multifamily, Lou Hoyes, and they moved Lou to head up single family. And so I went over to run multifamily. Now, I want to stop here and just tell people how significant this was. So we had a Black chairman, and Fannie Mae had three businesses. The portfolio business, which is where they bought and sold mortgage-backed securities and held them. The single family business, which is, when you got your mortgage from Wells Fargo or JP Morgan or a mortgage company, these are the people who guaranteed the mortgages and worked for all the mortgage lenders. And multifamily, which at that time was a relatively small business. Well, two of the three businesses were headed up by Black men. And the chairman, the head guy, was Black. Uh, the credit guy ended up a few years after I took over multifamily was Latino. I mean, so this was a very significant development. And it didn't really, I don't think a lot of people focused on it, but it was something that was very, very significant. And again, Jim Johnson created it, Frank Raines supported it. And so when I went to run multifamily in 2000, I think we had a portfolio of about 50 something billion. And when I left Fannie Mae 12 years later, it was 195 billion. So it was big. We made it bigger. And I was also responsible for our affordable housing initiatives too. So even though my main job was multifamily, I continued to oversee a lot of the affordable housing initiatives, a lot of the community development initiatives too.
Yeah, what you did was basically, expanded and revolutionized the housing sector during that period.
Mhm.
And then also you provided opportunities of inclusion, not only in terms of home ownership, but in terms of flow of managers, executives, leaders, did that grow to become part of your vision, or did that just evolve as a part of your tenure at Fannie Mae?
I think when I joined the street, when I came up, if you go back to that period, the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, that's when we were just starting to get in leadership roles. I remember like my good friend Bill Lewis became the first Black managing director at Morgan Stanley. Me, Fred Terrell, Bill Lewis, Ray McGuire, we all started on the street about the same time. Ken Chenault was over at American Express. So this was a time when, we were beginning to rise in financial institutions, and we kind of talked to each other, we supported each other. And so even when I was at Fannie Mae in multifamily, there were some Black guys in the business. So it was a guy, Daryl Carter and Quentin Primo, had a firm. And I helped later on. I tried to help some other people start firms. Herman Bulls had a lender. We had a limited number of lenders in multifamily. And so I tried to encourage people to be in the business. And I also tried to encourage my customers to hire people. And one of the things that's given me a lot of pleasure is seeing people who work for me, take leadership roles. So the guy who's in charge of the multifamily lending at JP Morgan and their community banking effort, Vince Toy, used to work for me. There's a guy who ran one of the big nonprofits, Brian McLaughlin, used to work for me. You've heard about Amazon doing stuff in affordable housing. In fact, there were two guys who worked for me, Brian Kenner and Victor Hoskins, who both became deputy mayors in Washington, D.C. And Victor is doing economic development for Fairfax County. Brian is working for Amazon, overseeing a lot of their community development efforts. So these were all people who kind of worked for me. And so I really tried to make it a point to nourish not only Black talent, but Latino talent, a lot of women. And so it's something that's given me a lot of pleasure and pride as I continue to see these people, do well.
Yeah. Put it in context for our audience. This is the 55th anniversary of Black Enterprise. And you were among, as well as created, some of the powerhouses of finance, not only within corporate America, but who became entrepreneurs who ran some of the largest investment banks in the nation, African American and otherwise. So this is something that I think is important for our audience to know, the role that you played and the players that you were involved in terms of the evolution of finance. I think it's the perfect time to segue to corporate governance. Having these experiences, developing these real talented corporate leaders and being engaged with these corporate leaders, was that when you signaled that you should engage in corporate governance. How did you first get that first board position? What led to that? Who helped drive that for you?
I wish I could tell you that this was all the result of some master plan and that I sat up and crafted
It
this.
was a master plan.
No, it didn't happen like that. You know, when I was in Philadelphia, the people who had held that job in Philadelphia before me had all lived outside the city. So this was the first time that that position at Senior Vice President Fannie Mae, I lived in the city. And one of my business school classmates introduced me to a lot of people. And so I became very involved in a lot of civic things in Philadelphia. And that meant I got to know a lot of people at Comcast, including the chairman, Brian Roberts. Brian's daughter and my son were at the same school. I'd see him at various social events. And, and every time I'd see him, I'd talk to him about his business. And I'm kind of a voracious reader of newspapers and business magazines and all that type of stuff. And so when I would see him, he'd always be surprised at how much I knew about Comcast. And I also got to know a guy, David Cohen, who was working for the mayor, Ed Rendell, and David Cohen went on to join Comcast. So there were various Comcast executives I got to know either in civic affairs, maybe at my son's school, where again, it was not we were drinking buddies, anything like that, but I'd see people. I was visible and I interacted with a lot of people. So I leave Philadelphia, I go to Fannie Mae, and I get a call one day. And one of my friends said, "Hey, you think you'd be interested in serving on the Comcast board?" And I said, hell yeah, right? I think it's a great company. And I went up and met with Brian. His dad, Ralph Roberts, was still involved with the company. And we talked. And again, I think they were impressed that I knew so much about the company. And then Brian and I had a one-on-one conversation. It turns out they had really wanted Frank Raines, chairman of Fannie Mae, but Frank was on the board of Time Warner. And somebody said, "Hey, doesn't Ken Bacon have a big job at Fannie?" And some people knew me. And when we talked, Brian was very open and honest. He says, "Look, I want some diversity on my board, but I want a businessman. I don't want, I'm not looking for a name. I'm not looking for a politician. I want somebody who's going to add value, support me when I'm right, tell me when I'm doing something wrong. He says, I want some, active participation and good advice." And we talked, and I remember something that said a lot about him. First of all, I was not the first Black board member there. His father, there had been a Black member before me. And I like to give Brian a lot of credit because, there was no pressure. This was before George Floyd. This was before there was a big effort. And he just wanted to do it because he felt it was the right thing to do. And I remember after talking to him, I said at one point, I said, "Well, Brian, I'm not usually on most boards, people, it's either like you're the CEO or you report to the CEO." So I said, "Brian, I don't report directly to the CEO. At that time, I was still a senior vice president." I said, "Look, I'm not even an executive vice president." He said, "I thought you had a big job." I said, "Yeah, well, I got a $90 billion portfolio." He said, "That's big enough for me." And so that's how it started. So again, it was through civic engagement, some social engagement, and like I said, the fact that Comcast was a big company in Philadelphia, so I don't want to make it seem like I studied every company. They were the big thing, and so that's how I got my first board position. It was, I was in the right place at the right time.
So, having gotten that position, and you weren't a CEO, you weren't in the
Mhm.
C-suite, but you did have as you said,
Uh,
a position and a massive portfolio, real estate.
mhm.
How did that experience, you know, further your leadership skills, help you at Fannie Mae, or as you were entering, or as you decided later on to develop
Mhm.
Railfield? What was
Mhm.
that experience like, and how did it help you develop as a corporate leader?
At first, to be honest, it was very intimidating.
Mhm.
I go into a room with people who were CEOs, right? Who made a heck of a lot more money than I did. Uh, and so I'd say my first year or two, I was probably kind of quiet, um, because I just didn't have that confidence. That came with time. And I had presented to boards both as a banker, I had presented to Fannie Mae's board, but when you sit on the other side of the table, you get a different perspective. You see people evaluate the CEO. You see them evaluate the CFO. So all of a sudden, I'm in the room, just like Hampton, I'm in the room where it happens, and that did a lot to not only broaden my horizons, it boosted my confidence. Uh, and again, I was fortunate that I had someone like Dick to tell me, "Hey, here's what's happening in the boardroom." And Brian and his father were both extremely supportive. I remember one time, this seems like a little thing, but I remember after one meeting, Ralph Roberts, who was, very old at that time, and I remember he took me aside and said, Ken, you ask very good questions. And I was over the moon when he did that, because that told me, okay, I'm doing the right thing. So I just say it gave me the confidence. I mean, look, I've always had confidence. I've always been a little cocky. And I think any Black businessman of my generation, you had to do that, because when you went into the room, most of the time, there was no one who looked like you. So if you didn't believe in yourself, it wasn't like there were going to be a whole lot of other people. So, you could talk to Dick, you could talk to a Ken Chenault, you could talk to Vernon, but they weren't going to be in the room with you every day. So you had to believe in yourself. But this helped me raise my aspirations and my confidence to a different level, a higher level.
So in a sense, it helped you find your voice in the boardroom.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think this, you know, having this discussion is vitally important, especially for younger members of our audience who are looking at
Hmm.
positions on boards. Share with me, and you talked about the elder Roberts taking you aside and talking about your focus on questions
Hmm.
that were vital and that
Hmm.
helped drive the
Hmm.
deliberations.
Hmm.
That eventually leads to
Hmm.
increasing performance and shareholder value.
Hmm.
But give our audience, especially the younger executives who are looking
Hmm.
at board experience or who are getting their first board experience, some pointers on what they should do and take away from that first experience that you had.
I think one of the things, remember, you're on the board, you're there to create shareholder value. So you have to understand not only general business principles, but you have to understand the business that you're in. You have to understand the culture. I always tell people you don't want to go on a board where you aren't in tune with the values of the company or the values of the CEO. And I have had and continue to have all the respect in the world for the values of Comcast as a corporation. Now, this is going to be somebody's going to complain about their cable service, I know, but I'm just saying, as a corporation, it's a great place. Um, and so, again, you're there to create shareholder value. But at the same time, you should be under no illusion that the reason you're in that board, that what made it possible was the efforts of a lot of people who didn't have MBAs, who weren't going to be there. In other words, it was you know, the civil rights movement, it was the politicians, it was the people pressing to break the hold that white males had on these positions forever. So you always have to not only create shareholder value, but you've also got to do things to help, you know, advance your people, right? And so you can't make that, you don't want to can't walk into a meeting and just go black, 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 black. But you have to be there. So one of the things I tried to do in all my boards, I try to reach out to people who look like me to give them encouragement, to give them feedback, to give them advice. I have to balance that with, again, I can't say anything that's, from inside the boardroom, but just like Dick did with me, you give people good general advice, and you kind of support things. Maybe it's who they contract with. Maybe it's getting someone else on the board. So there's a board I chair, and Welltower, which is probably the fourth biggest REIT in the country now. And at Welltower, when I became chair of the CEO, we were looking for some new directors. And the CEO, I mean, a lot of times search firms don't always do the best job of identifying, Black talent. And the CEO turned to me one day and said, and who's Indian, and said, Ken, here are two Black guys I know. And one of those people, Ade Patton, is on the board at Welltower now. Sometimes it's encouraging a pipeline. So at Ally, where I'm on the board, the CEO there had created a robust program for people from HBCUs, kids to intern there in the summer. So, sometimes it might be the company's doing something and you just support it. Sometimes it's you're urging the company to create something. So, it's what I say, you're wearing two hats. You're doing the shareholder value, but you're also trying to make sure that you create, a culture that is welcoming to people who look like you.
So that philosophy and that focus sparks two questions. So as part of your DNA, as part of your board service, you saw it as your obligation to focus on, in part, diversification of the board and finding diverse talent to fill board seats, as well as different areas of the company from entry level to management. And then secondly, how does that transfer into board leadership and corporate leadership? Because one of the challenges that we've seen in developing our board list is that there's been we've had a flow of Black directors over the past 10 to 15 years in our development of the list, and then it accelerated during the George Floyd period, but it seems like it's decelerating or stagnating now.
That's right.
Discussion of diversity in the boardroom and throughout corporate America is becoming far more challenged. And so as a board member and in your discussions with other African-American board members and board members in general, how do you focus on that area and put that back on the table for conversation and, more importantly, for action in terms of increasing the flow of representation across the board?
Number one, like I say, at the end of the day, it's about creating shareholder value. And so the way I always talk about diversity is not diversity for diversity's sake. But I remember something that Lou Hoy is the guy who headed up multifamily at Fannie Mae before me. And we were once talking, and we were on a panel, I think, at Harvard Business School, because he was an HBS alum. And Lou said something that, it sounds so simple, but he says, if there are 100 people and only, 35 or 40 are white males, and that's all you talk to, what about the rest of those people? Do you think there's no talent there? He says, where is the best talent? If you don't talk to everybody, you won't find the best talent. So the way I look at diversity is I tell people, like, you got to broaden your horizons to find the best talent. And if you just limit it to certain schools, a certain gender, or a certain race, you're not going to find the best talent. So, so that's one thing. In other words, I try to tie what I'm doing to this is the way we're going to create value for our shareholders. It's number one. And number two is that, if people see you doing the right thing, because remember, a lot of times, you're the pioneer, you're the one that people interact with, and like it or not, if you do a poor job, there's always going to be somebody, see, we gave him a shot. It didn't work out. What I find ironic now about the attacks on DEI, that like when I looked at what happened at Harvard when people jumped on it, my thing was, let's talk about who went to Harvard. Let's talk about Ray McGuire. Let's talk about Bill Lewis. Let's talk about Deval Patrick. Let's talk about the lawyers, the politicians, the businessmen that school produced, right? I don't want to get into an argument about SATs and all that stuff. Let's talk about the bottom line, about what they were able to produce. And so when I look at corporate life, we can talk about Ken Chenault as a pioneer, but look at the value that he created at American Express. So
Yeah.
that's the thing. I think you have to tie it back to value creation. And what I found at the George Floyd, when a group of us, senior executives, senior directors got together, there were a lot of boards. I remember I talked to one board where the guy literally said, well, we're kind of like an engineering focused company and we can't find any. Now you want to say, come on, right? So, but what I did, I said, here, I'm going to give you 4 or 5 names to go talk to, right? And a lot of times the reaction was, wow, we didn't know this talent was out there. We didn't know these people existed. And quite frankly, in the 80s, if you went to one of the Ivies or you went to Howard or Morehouse, you went to certain schools, you kind of knew a lot of people. Well, when we came up together around George Floyd, I was astounded at how much talent there was out there, Black talent that was out there that I didn't even know about. I used to joke. I said, well, I guess I'm too old and just don't know what's happening. But there's an amazing amount of talent out there, an amazing amount. And so there's no excuse for people when people say, I can't find it, then I'm saying you ain't looked in the right place.
Yeah, for me, that provides me with a bit of head scratching because
Yeah.
I talk about our history with Black enterprise, but through that history, we talked about Dick Parsons, Ken Chenault, these leaders of finance, Ray McGuire, not to mention, the women that have also produced real value for corporations and throughout this nation. And it just seems like as, leaders on a board, you would want to get that A team to move your corporations further. And you would want to tap that A team to get their proteges and the people that they've developed and to keep that become a continuous cycle to create shareholder value for years and decades to come. I just don't understand why there's just not that continued focus, especially since this is proven leadership, this is proven value creation, and it's been over time. And relationship.
I think when we look around the political arena today, if you really listen to the conversation, there are a lot of people who want to go back. They want to move back, and that's their comfort zone, right? But fortunately, if there's anything that gives me hope. I mean, when I look at a lot of America's leading corporations, there is a realization that we need to broaden our horizons. But there are areas I'm disappointed in. Look, I'm a Stanford alum. In fact, me, my brother, my 2 children all went to Stanford. I was a trustee. And so I've spent a lot of time around Silicon Valley. And I'm amazed at the arguments I hear advanced for the lack of diversity in a lot of Silicon Valley companies. And the most common one was, well, there are not enough Blacks in science, technology, engineering, et cetera. And I once asked, I won't mention the head of one company, I was at a small private gathering. And I said, let me ask you, how many of your jobs require an engineering degree? And they said, well, about 30 or 40%. I said, oh, right. I just let that hang in the air. And the reason I let that hang in the air was, in other words, the majority of your jobs, finance, marketing, et cetera. I mean, again, as I said earlier, IBM and Xerox were the tech companies when I started in business in the 80s. And they were amazingly diverse. Ended up with Ursula Burns at Xerox. I remember Ira Hall. who was also a Stanford guy, was a treasurer at IBM. So this argument that the tech companies have about the engineering, and by the way, there are Black engineers. That's another myth. But my point is that a lot of times people, what I discovered in Silicon Valley, for example, is one venture capitalist explained to me, guys start companies, they want to retain control. They go to, who is my lab partner? Who is my fraternity brother? And if you look at a lot of these companies that have had scandals and poor corporate governance, it's because people tended to hire their buddies. They weren't looking for the best talent. They were looking for the best buddy a lot of times. So yeah, there are some industries that have a lot of work to do, but most of the arguments that people advance for the lack of diversity, when you really press them, they're weak.
The looking at just your experience, and we touched on management, just wanted to share that in terms of going at Welltower, you became chair of Welltower, of the board of Welltower. Are you seeing more developments that are providing opportunities for that level of leadership? We touched on that a bit, but I really wanted to focus on that because as we developed the board and we talked about acceleration of Black directors, corporate directors, we haven't seen an acceleration of, Black directors in those leadership roles. And I think that something that's vital and something that we want to focus on as we continue to develop our list. How can we help fuel that? How can we help drive the discussions of that? Just your general thoughts on that.
I think it's a reflection of the culture of various companies. So if you look at AT&T, Bill Kennard is chair there. Verizon, Clarence Otis is lead director. You're starting to see, like I say, the talent show itself. And but it takes a while. The first battle was to get in the boardroom, period. Then, like I say, it takes a while to establish yourself at the board. And so I think the longer we're at some of these boards, the more you're going to see that happen. So I'm beginning to see people as lead directors or the head of committees. So, I'm chair at Welltower, but at Comcast, I head up corporate governance nominations. At Ally, I head up the risk committee. And that's what I'm beginning to see more and more often, is that people taking committee roles. And again, some of us even, like I say, getting up to the level of chair or lead director. And of course, the real prize is to be the CEO of a company or to be executive chair. But you look at Marvin Ellison at Lowe's, you look at the sister TIA Pref, who used to work at Fannie Mae, by the way. You see Mark Mason at Citibank. You see Leslie Hale, who's heading up a big REIT. So I'm not happy because I think there should be more, but I think that we've got a toehold. And the question is, given the changes in the political discourse in the country, are we going to be able to hold on, and are we going to be able to expand that? And I'm being guardedly optimistic because I think that there's also this myth that, we only got these jobs because of affirmative action. And I think, again, as I always tell people that I said, there was no affirmative action in the earnings at American Express. You look at what Marvin Ellison has done at Lowe's. You start looking at the numbers, they speak for themselves.
Ken, you have been extremely generous with your time. This conversation has been fascinating. I'm glad we've gotten a chance to talk.
Yeah.
I've gotten a chance to interview and talk to all the people that you shared, and now I'm glad you made the list, and I could share your journey along with the journeys of others that have been proven powerhouses and have been transformative forces. But before we leave, I just wanted to ask you if you had any last bits of advice, any final points you'd like to make in terms of corporate leadership, corporate governance, and the ascension of African Americans in corporate America and business in this current environment.
Well, if you look behind me, you see some pictures. You see a kind of a white-haired lady. That's my paternal grandmother. And then another picture further back, that's my mother and my daughter when she was 5. And I learned a lot from those 2 ladies. So from my grandmother, had that thing, hard work ain't never killed nobody. So my grandmother and my grandfather, Frank Bacon, that man worked 7 days a week. And so I always tell people, 1, you cannot be outworked. You got to be the hardest working person there. And my mother once said something when I didn't get a bonus I thought I should get. I remember some advice she gave me. She said, boy, you're too old and too black to expect life to be fair. So get over it. And when I tell that to people, they kind of scrunch up their head. But my mother's thing is, it ain't going to be fair. And if you get hung up on that and you get angry and you get depressed and you get discouraged, you'll never advance. It's not fair. It's not even fair for all the white guys sometimes. So you have to make it a point to, as my mother said, you get over it, you get around it, but you keep moving. So hard work, perseverance, tough mental fortitude, and you can do a lot.
And this has been a great conversation. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for sharing.
Thank you for having me. God bless.